Hi everyone, my name is Alice and I'm a 21-year-old student of World Philosophies in the UK, and I have a channel here on YouTube called Over the Curve. Today I want to give you guys an introduction to the theory of personal identity in Buddhist religion and their idea of the no self. And thank you so much to the StudyTube project creators for making this platform where people can learn in these really weird times. It's such an amazing idea. So for many of us, the idea of having one's own identity that sets us apart from other humans is just common sense. In everyday life, many humans believe that they know who they are as individuals. In philosophy, however, there hasn't actually been a general consensus about what is it that makes us who we are. In contemporary metaphysics, the approach is usually to ask, what are the necessary conditions for person X to be the same at time 1 as person Y at time 2? So essentially, even when you grow old, your physical appearance changes, your ideas change. What is the one thing that still makes you you? Philosophers argue about whether that is through physical continuity, so your body staying a certain way the same, or psychological continuity. So the Buddha approached the question completely differently and asked, is there even a self at all? Obviously, this question and the answer to this question has so many implications in ethics and religion, etc. Now, if you don't know, the Buddha, who was originally called Siddhartha Gautama, was around in the 5th century BCE, and he's considered a major philosopher and religious leader. So Buddhists reject the idea of personal identity as we originally know it, and instead go for a bundle theory of personhood. The core doctrine of Buddhism is called Anatman, which means no self. And it is important to note that this means no self in the permanent sense of a self that we would normally think of it. And this doctrine of Anatman is where Buddhist and Hindu thought kind of converges, because in Hindu thought there is the soul, which is called the Atman. So the Buddhists consider the no self doctrine to be really important as well, because it is one of the things you need to know to start your journey on the path of enlightenment towards nirvana. And there are 3 things that you need to know to do this. 1 is the theory of no self, 2 is impermanence, and 3 is suffering. So the Buddha first wants to establish what do we mean by the self, and in language we would usually refer to it using the I. But even deeper than this, he's talking about what the essence of a person actually is. So what is the one thing that a person would not exist without? They're also not talking about what describes qualitative identity, so we're not talking about like the idea of finding yourself. So what matters here as well is how the Buddhists see the world. So they believe that humans have a tendency to create an identity from streams of phenomena. And the reason we do this is because we want some permanent thing that can ease what they would call human suffering, which is part of us being in the world. But they say that actually the idea of a permanent self has a detrimental effect on our well-being, because it encourages us to be ignorant. So the only way of solving the problem of human suffering and reaching nirvana is accepting that there is no permanent self. So how do they approach this? The Buddha invites us to think about the parts of the self we would normally consider that make up a human. So the mind, the body, the emotions, whatever you want. His logic is to piece together everything that we would consider makes up a human and find out which of those we could count as the self. So if none of these parts can be identified with the referent I, then there is no permanent self. So to do this, the Buddha produces what he thinks is an exhaustive list of what makes up a person. So the self must be identified with one of these aggregates, or what they're called skandhas. The first is called rupa, which means the material form or your body. 2 is vedana, which means aggregates of sensation and feeling and all that. Samjana is the apperception, or the capacity to comprehend. Samskara is volitions and tendencies and dispositions. And the last one is vijnana, which is consciousness. So the Buddha believes that those 5 things, 5 skandhas, all represent the basis of what we designate as persons. So when we think of a person, we usually think of one of those 5 aggregates. But he argues that none of these aggregates are permanent, and none of them make up the identity of the self throughout time. And remember, the self has to be a permanent and persistent entity. For that reason, none of the aggregates that I listed count as the self. So for example, the physical aggregate is impermanent because the body arises and goes away, and generally that's what a lot of people agree with if they're like mind-body dualists. However, where the Buddha differs is that he says that the four nama or mental skandhas are not permanent either. He says that they are not the mind at all, they're just a stream of distinct events in constant flux. So this is connected to another important concept in Buddhist philosophy, which is called the principle of dependent arising. So this is the belief that everything on the world and its existence depends on the existence of something else, so there is a chain. So it's not the idea that the self is simply nothing, but more that the identity can only come from the flow of like psychophysical processes, and there is no same entity that is within each of those processes. In part, this is kind of a problem of language, that as humans we tend to assign an identity to a stream of events. And the Buddhists argue that we too easily accept the idea of a self, even though our emotions, our thoughts, our bodies change constantly over time. So one way of thinking of how we use language is the Buddhists would say, instead of saying it rains or it thinks, we should say there is rain or there is thinking. So it is more an event in a stream of things rather than an assigned identity. And we invent these links to provide stability in our lives, in a sense to hold the world together. So remember, all of these ideas are connected to how the Buddhists view the world. So in a nutshell, the Buddhists focus on a self that is composite but not unified. But it is important to note that Buddhists are not annihilationists, so at no point are they saying that we completely lack any identity, because obviously there would be some detrimental and negative consequences from that. But because they believe in the doctrine of rebirth, then our actions still have impact and consequences, and there's still kind of the implicit idea that the Buddhists are searching for something, a transcendental self, and reaching nirvana. So there is a kind of meaning and goal to life. So I hope that you have learnt something and that this gave you something to think about. Maybe consider, what would you think would be the aspect of someone's identity that could persist over time. Thank you again to the StudyTube project, and if you're interested in checking out my YouTube or Instagram, I will put it somewhere on the screen. And yeah, bye everyone.